The Effect of the 2004 Tsunami on Galle, Sri Lanka by Sela-Pade. Growing up in Australia, I sat around many Christmas tables and meals discussing my parents' and extended family's experience growing up in Sri Lanka. My parents will still tell me stories of travelling by train and road from the capital city of Colombo to the beachside town of Galle. Through stories, I pictured idyllic locations including beaches and fish markets to staying at the Galle Face Hotel, visiting the fort and seeing the place where my great-grandfather Tommy Keller played as a member of Sri Lanka's first cricket team, bowling out Britain's W.G. Grace out at the Galle Face cricket grounds. While I did visit in 1972, my 18-month-old memories are non-existent. The impact of the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami was felt directly by my family. We were awaiting news from family and friends who'd made the pilgrimage back to the homeland for Christmas, finally receiving news about their safety and the devastation that had occurred. Sunday the 26th of December 2004 saw a magnitude 9.2 earthquake off the coast of Sumatra. This would be felt by 13 of the 14 Sri Lankan coastal districts, hitting its first point on the island's east coast at approximately 8:45 a.m. and the south coast at 9:15 due to reflective waves. With more than 30,000 dead, 8,000 disappearances, 20,000 injured, 500,000 people displaced and at least 2 million affected, Sri Lanka would later be named as the region's second most devastated country. In 2015, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction saw disaster risk as being the potential loss of life, injury, destroyed or damaged assets, which could occur to a system, society or community in a specific period, determined by probabilistic as a function of hazard, exposure, vulnerability and capability. When applying this to the effect on society, one needs to look at the challenges of the unique group from a whole of government to a whole of society approach. Sri Lanka is an island country with 65,610 kilometres of landmass and a coastline of 1,340 kilometres, located 60 kilometres from the mainland of southeast India in the Indian Ocean. The country's tropical climate ranges between 20 and 31 degrees. Traditionally a nation of hunters, fishermen and farmers, deforestation has occurred as a result of colonisation. Sri Lanka has been under Portuguese rule from 1505 to 1658, the Dutch government from 1658 to 1796, and British rule from 1796 to 1948. Later, civil unrest from the Liberation Tigers of the Tamil Eelam from 1970 to 2000. British rule had the most significant impact on the environment, with forest coverings reduced from 80% in the 1820s to 43% in the 1940s. The post-independent rule will see this covering dropped to 23% because of rapid urbanisation to support the economy. The impact on soil, pollution of air, water, land, and wildlife led to the need for environmental regulations to be introduced in 1972. However, despite these conservation attempts, new entrepreneurs found loopholes to which these guidelines could be manipulated, further placing stress on the environment and local community. Education had always played an essential role in Sri Lanka, With a high level of literacy, the predominantly religious-based schools provided the inhabitants access to quality education pre-independence. This was then maintained by the government to sustain the development in the country's economic well-being. Migration has often been an issue in Sri Lanka. Approximately 2 million people left between 1960 and 1980 due to voluntary migration or refugee status. In the 1960s and 70s, migration was often to further education and career, but mainly for economic opportunities. Foreseeing potential government instability, the 1980s saw a large population of Tamils leave the country under refugee status because of the Tamil militant groups, which would affect the economies of the country as well as its safety. While this may not have been significant, this migration saw highly educated citizens leave the country. This, along with the religious diversity, is a significant impact of the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami on Sri Lanka's seaside town of Galle. The southern province of Galle is 119 kilometres via train from Sri Lanka's capital of Colombo. With a population of 91,000, the predominantly Buddhist provincial city has a small population of Muslim, Hindus and Christians. Steeped in history, Galle is also home to the Galle International Stadium, the Galle Fort and universities, and it is the location that local and tourists travel to stay during holidays. Its economy relies on the tourist market and fishings. Homes are built of brick, concrete, tin or tile, yet buildings' poor codes do not enforce the need for reinforced steel or ensure that drainage is adequate. At 9:20 on the 26th of December 2004, the tsunami broke through Galle City. The effects of the wave continued for several hours. Flooding and wave inundation, mainly through the man-enhanced Dutch canals, swept inland up to 5 kilometres. The non-porous walls of the Galle Fort, built in the 1600s, split the waves and formed rivers that divided around poorly constructed homes and the buildings of the city. This resulted in 4,500 deaths and the near destruction of the city. Before this event, only 2 tsunamis were recorded in Sri Lanka, one in 1881 and the other in 1883. While Sri Lanka drafted the Disaster Management Act in 2000, this had not been widely adopted. Galle was provided with a disaster preparedness and response plan, but a loophole in the plan and act meant that the country was unprepared for such an event. In the small town of Perelia, the Matara Express, a regular train that operated between Colombo and Galle, was found at 4 a.m. by an armoured helicopter. Approximately 1,700 people were aboard the train and only 150 survived. The wave had swamped the train at around 9:30 a.m. At the Galle bus station, approximately 2,000 people were killed by waves that drowned them in the seat they sat in while waiting for buses of leaves. Shards of glass and metal sheets were broken by water pressure. All 3 waves hit the Galle Maternity Hospital. At the time, 379 patients and infants were residing in the hospital. 1 infant was reported lost during this time. The hospital's medical equipment and infrastructure were destroyed, along with the Mahadodora Teaching Hospital and local medical centres. Karapataya teaching hospital was the district's only medical resource left standing, resulting in its inability to cope. 12,000 houses in Galle were demolished, most within 100 metres of the ocean, owned by fishermen whose livelihood, businesses and accommodations intertwined. 75% of the fishermen were now out of work due to these losses. While town water had not been available to the residents for many years after civil unrest, residents had relied on town water well. The tsunami meant that these wells and the water table were destroyed or polluted. Electricity and sewerage and communication systems were damaged. However, given the primary infrastructure of these facilities were inland, while damage did occur, they were back online within short periods of time where possible. 537 micro businesses, 368 small to medium enterprises, and 929 services and manufacturing operations in the Galle district were affected. Losses included staff, inventory, plant and equipment. The Galle Cricket Stadium overlooking the Indian Ocean directly behind the Galle Fort, a group of English schoolboys survived after climbing onto the pavilion's roof for safety when the wave hit. Out of the 49 hotels in Galle, 27 were able to remain open post-tsunami. In some locations, guests moved to higher locations when the wave hit, minimising the loss, where other hotels and guests were swept out to sea. Unable to cope with a disaster of such magnitude on a post-Christmas weekend, the Sri Lankan government struggled to respond to the disaster that had affected almost the entire circumference of the island. It would take 24 hours for a command centre to be established and an additional 2 days to be fully operational. During this time, community leaders turned undamaged religious buildings into makeshift shelters for displaced members of the community. International aid for Sri Lanka poured in. However, many of the donations could not be utilised. These included winter clothing too warm for the climate, baby bottles that were unable to be sterilised in makeshift camps, enclosed shoes not worn by locals, expired medicines and sanitary products that were never used in the first place. There was more water than the community could use. While being displayed, the district of Galle was still proud and not wanting to be known as beggars. Volunteers comprised of locals, expatriates who'd left during mass migration, and holiday makers, all whom arrived to help with the rebuilding and humanitarian aid. This first wave of help was to work with the community and following their own sense of principle and priority. The second wave of volunteers that arrived was that of the non-government agencies, consulting with government and researching to decipher the best way to help locals. These agencies aim to nurture the locals and work within the government guidelines. At times constrained due to political intervention, the downfall of many of these agencies was that they felt that locals did not know what they required. Sri Lanka has a literacy rate of 92% and a sizable government workforce. While the average income is $3,540 and access to health work is readily available before the tsunami, Sri Lanka required help in re-establishing and improving infrastructure, not creating it. The final wave of support came from government. This support was complex in that it was entangled in political, military, and religious doctrine, eventually leading to corruption and bribery. 70,000 families were displaced by the tsunami at Galle and forced to move into new locations to rebuild the city in safe and secure areas. During the rebuild process, the 100-metre buffer zone that the pre-tsunami government had established was reinforced. Lack of land now forced these people further away from the shorelines of Galle and required them to move kilometres away. The aim of rebuilding home was to drive them out of temporary shelters with minimal infrastructure and preventing them from building on unsafe foundation in the buffer zone. Reluctant locals were strongly encouraged to move into rapidly constructed, donated homes, away from familiar cultural homes and into socio-economic communities, hoping that they would feel safe. Children were required to move schools while dealing with the loss of family, friends, and the locations where they had once felt emotionally safe. The displaced locals, who had always suffered due to poverty, were relocated into new communities, felt vulnerable in these areas that were culturally and religiously diverse. They were also felt betrayed by the government that did allow development of tourism-related businesses and building infrastructures and buildings to remain in this area. However, they were receptive to the fact that the fishery buildings were now reinforced and able to stay in these areas. Families forced to relocate were known as the tsunami villages. Some turned to alcohol and illicit drugs because of the events. Most were fishermen who now had no livelihood, but also the lack of opportunity to recover due to the loss of both an equipment, but also the loss of fishing stock in local waters. Poorly constructed homes because of corruption and oversight, considered by inhabitants at times equally as unsafe as if they had remained in their tsunami-destroyed homes. At the Galle Cricket Ground, many of the local unauthorised pavilions were destroyed during the tsunami. These buildings were constructed during a time when local government and tourism could not reach an agreement. It was widely expected that facilities would appear without approval due to bribery, compromising quality and safety. This occurred not only at the cricket grounds, but also throughout the province. The rebuilding of the ground was seen as a culturally significant for the community to return back to normal. The reconstruction of the cricket ground would also bring economic benefit to the city of Galle. The psychological needs for the district to have a place where they could participate in sporting activities was seen as essential to the well-being and recovery of the city. Physical infrastructure was rebuilt and reopened in temporary buildings by the end of 2005. The level of which development and redevelopment occurred depended upon the location and the original state of the building pre-tsunami. Given that some of the buildings were already in disrepair due to the civil unrest in the community had to wait for additional fundings. This often resulted in feeling that they'd been disadvantaged for circumstances that they could not control. The most significant conflict would be seen as in those that provided help and those who required help. In times of vulnerabilities, those aiding had often little understanding of the necessary emotional, cultural, and physical needs of those in need. Enforcing a top-down housing as a product outcome instead of a project-driven positive association with creating a home, resulting in a post-tsunami psychological stress for individuals. The intent should have not been concentrated on pre-tsunami, post-civil destruction philosophy, but rather a recovery that will allow for a better society that will allow for growth and recovery while mitigating risk for both the natural and management disaster conflict. Galle fought a heritage listed building where many concerned with the impact of the wave. While damage was minimal, the ability for housing within the old city was blocked. However, this area will now house fishing and vegetable markets, providing safety in economic situations. By reviewing the outcomes of the 2004 tsunami, while there is little doubt Sri Lanka was not prepared in the first 24 hours, they did show their ability to ensure the Centre of National Operations was operational. While domestic and international aid is built on health, education and social services, it did not consider the community's cultural sensitivity and local appropriateness. Had a multidisciplinary approach been considered, the mental and psychological impact on the community may have been less challenging. The implementation of a robust disaster management structure based on community engagement could have been further improved by the number of organisations wishing to be involved in a post-tsunami. However, government intervention created a roadmap based on the best knowledge of other countries and allowed it to be flexible as the country rebuilt. The National Disaster Management Centre focuses on the mitigation of post-disaster response, hazard warning and coordinations of other agencies. A bottom-up approach allows for the villages and communities to play an important factor and role in the process, mitigation based on local government, financial and humane resources.